Hello and welcome to this Constitution Unit seminar. I'm Alan Renwick, Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, and today we're looking at the UK government's proposals for reforming our electoral institutions. Over the summer, as many of you will be aware, ministers published a policy paper setting out plans for reforms in various areas, including votes at 16, automated electoral registration, political finance rules, harassment and intimidation in the context of elections, voter ID, and various other matters. They also, through the English Devolution Bill, are currently seeking to restore the supplementary vote system for electing mayors and police and crime commissioners, reversing the previous government's introduction of first past the post. On the other hand, they notably, and to many people rather surprisingly, said that they will not be removing the limits on Electoral Commission independence that were introduced in 2022 through the so-called strategy and policy statement. There's also nothing in the paper on election law consolidation, which is a concern for many people who have to run elections. And of course, there are wider questions about the future of first past the post for Westminster elections, which the government's paper doesn't look at all. So even without getting to the proportional representation debate, which is of course a big one, there are many questions for us to be exploring today. Are tighter rules needed on political donations? Do the proposed changes to voter ID go far enough? Should more be done to protect the independence of the Electoral Commission? And many, many other questions besides. So to explore these questions, we're joined by a great panel of speakers. Tom Hawthorn is Head of Policy at the Electoral Commission. Rose Whiffen is Senior Research Officer at Transparency International UK. Cat Smith MP is Labour MP for Lancaster and Wyre, and also a great expert on electoral matters, having been a shadow minister as what became the Elections Act 2022 was going through Parliament, and also having served on the Speaker's Committee on the Electoral Commission. And David Howarth is Professor of Law and Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, former Liberal Democrat MP for Cambridge, and also a former Electoral Commissioner between 2010 and 2018. So welcome to all of our speakers. It's fantastic to have all of you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. Our plan is very much along the usual lines for a Constitution Unit seminar. So each of the speakers will make opening remarks. After that, we'll have some discussion on the panel, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. Questions will be gathered today by Tom Fleming, whom you can also see on your screen. So if you have a question that you would like to put to the panel, please do write it in the Q&A function on Zoom. Some of you may be watching on our YouTube live stream. You can't submit a question there, but you're not too late to go to the Constitution Unit's website, register for the event, and get the Zoom link. So if you really do want to ask a question, you can do it that way. Tom will select a broad range of the questions that have been submitted and read them out. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, you can do that. Just indicate when you submit your question. And just finally, I should note that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the Constitution Unit's website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast feed after the event. And you might want to take that into account when deciding whether to ask your question anonymously. So that's enough by way of introduction. I will pass straight over to Tom Hawthorn, to get us going.
Great, thank you ever so much, Alan, and thank you for the invitation to come and talk today. As any good student of political communication, I'm going to make use of the rule of three, and I want to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of the proposals that we've seen around elections so far. So first of all, the good. I think it's really, really important for us to recognise that the strategy paper sets out some really, really good proposals on issues that lots of us in this space have been talking about for a long, long time, and lots of things that we should be really pleased to see if they follow through into legislation. So things like moving to a system of more automatic or direct electoral registration is going to really help move towards a more effective and efficient registration process, and should lead to us having more people correctly registered. We know that there are big problems with under-registration in inaccurate registers. The proposals around digital ID for voting polling stations, including digital versions of our new voter authority certificate, again, these are really going to improve voting and access to voting in polling stations. On the political finance regulation side of things, the proposals around know your donor requirements and new or bringing into force donor declaration requirements, these are all going to really help to reduce the risk of impermissible donations, and particularly thinking about that risk of potential foreign donations. And they're going to help improve public confidence and improve the integrity of the political funding framework. And similarly, the reforms to unincorporated associations that are set out in the paper, they're really going to help improve transparency about who's responsible for unincorporated associations and where they get their funding from and how they're using that funding, which is currently an area which is a lot grayer than I think all of us would like to see. And then one other really important thing from our perspective is looking at reclassifying some of the offences in electoral law and aligning enforcement for candidate spending rules with the Commission's existing equivalent duties for political parties and non-party campaigners. It's going to be a much more proportionate and consistent framework in future, and we think that's going to be reassuring for candidates in particular, that they're not going to face the threat of criminal sanctions for relatively straightforward administrative failures. And it's also going to hopefully provide reassurance for voters that there is a body who's going to be able to take action where that's needed. And then just in terms of the bad, the things that perhaps weren't mentioned in the strategy that we would have liked to have seen, I think around strengthening the rules around company donations, that's mentioned in the paper, which is really, really positive. And that's something we want to see addressed. But there's no mention of profit in the tests that the government might be considering applying to company donations. We think that's really important to provide that assurance that the risk of foreign funding coming through companies can be properly addressed. So we really want to see something more on that. It's notable that overseas voters is not mentioned at all, really, in any great detail. We've seen issues at general elections going back to 2015, repeatedly seeing overseas voters who aren't able to participate get their votes counted because the postal service, either in the UK or in the country where they're living, just isn't able to accommodate the timescales that we work to. And if nothing changes, we think we're going to see the same problems again when the next general election is held in 28 or 29. Unless the government have got some very clever non-legislative solutions that they're looking at implementing, we're not going to see those improvements that we need. And then you've already mentioned it, Alan, on the strategy and policy statement for the Electoral Commission. I'm slightly reluctant to focus on the Commission, but I think it's important that we're clear that we remain opposed to the principle of a strategy and policy statement. The independence and impartiality of our Commission must be clear for voters and campaigners to see, and this form of influence or even potential influence from a government is inconsistent with that role. So we would like to see the Elections Act provisions repealed and those powers removed from the legislation, rather than just a restatement or a different statement being introduced. And then finally, the ugly, if it's not too rude to use that phrase, I wanted to talk about electoral law. Electoral law is already complex, voluminous, fragmented, to use the terms that the law commissions have identified. And this is going to be a big bill. There's no doubt about it if these policy proposals are all followed through. And inevitably, that's going to make the state of electoral law much worse. It's really positive that we've had some positive noises from successive ministers. They've recognised the problem, but it does need a commitment of resources and parliamentary time. Otherwise, it's going to be increasingly difficult for future governments to implement the policy changes that they were elected to deliver. And I want to just cite one small example. So a change last year to add veterans cards to the list of accepted ID for voting in polling stations needed an SI that was 72 pages long, full of amendments to all of the different sets of regulations. So we can see some real practical challenges for officials and ministers in actually just delivering their policy priorities. And then the very last thing that I wanted to mention is just about devolution of electoral law in Scotland and Wales, which also means that it's increasingly challenging to ensure there's a coherent framework of laws that work well for voters, campaigners, and electoral administrators. We've seen an example around the extension of the online absent voting process, which is in place for UK Parliament elections and elections for local government in England. But it's not available for voters in Scotland and Wales ahead of the elections next year, for example. And we don't want to see that situation repeated. So it's going to be really essential for the UK government, as it's developing its proposals and the legislation, to be talking to the governments in both Edinburgh and Cardiff to find ways to minimise those risks, while also obviously respecting the rights of those legislatures to set their own policy decisions.
That's really helpful, Tom. Thank you so much. Straight over to Rose.
Thanks so much, Alan, and thanks for the invitation as well. And I'm going to follow a little bit of a similar structure, actually, Tom, of rule of three. So from a corruption risk perspective, we at Transparency International UK are concerned about the political finance elements of these reforms, as well as changes to strengthening the Electoral Commission. So I'd like to take the political finance reforms in three buckets, let's call them. So these would be loopholes to address potential foreign interference, the powers of the Electoral Commission, and finally, big money in our politics. And the latter, big money in politics, is the area I'll focus on the most, as this is the area which was definitely overlooked by the government in these proposals, and is arguably the biggest key to building integrity and restoring trust, which was the intention of this policy statement. So if I take each in turn, firstly, we have loopholes to address potentially impermissible and otherwise foreign donations entering our democracy. And overall, these proposals from the government were positive, but there are still a few niggling details about how they will be implemented. And Tom also mentioned the profit test for companies donating. And this was a reform looking to address this very low and vague bar of allowing companies to donate if they had carried on business in the UK. And our research and checks and balances found that 10.9 million had been donated to political parties, and we don't actually know the true source of those funds. So the policy statement, what it said was that donations from shell companies are not going to be permitted anymore. And that companies will have to have sufficient UK generated income in order to donate. And yeah, we would hope that those government proposals of sufficient income will manifest itself as a profit test. So something like net profits generated after tax. And this is what CSPL have recommended previously. And we think it's a more watertight test rather than one, say, based on revenue. So moving to the next bucket, it would be the powers of the Electoral Commission. So starting with the positives is that the sanctioning ability of the Commission has been increased to £500,000, and this is from £20,000. And this is really critical in allowing the Commission to deter and sanction wrongdoing. And if you look at sort of the vast sums donated and spent at elections, £20,000 really pales into insignificance. And to a certain extent, 500,000 also doesn't look that much when you look at sort of 2024, almost 100 million being spent by parties. So that's why we would support the CSPR recommendation, which was £500,000 as the sanction, or 4% of total spend. And this has already been mentioned, but we also obviously believe in the independence of the Electoral Commission. And the strategy and policy statement has already been mentioned, sorry. But I think what's really crucial here is that how inconsistent this sort of interference is. And analysis from Spotlight on Corruption found that it contradicts at least 5 global standards on electoral management body independence. So we would agree with the comments from Tom about repealing that provision. And now lastly, turning to the last bucket of big money in politics. And I think this is really the elephant in the room of these proposals that went unaddressed, and is absolutely key to the government's own aims of restoring trust in our democracy. So our democracy, it should be serving public interests and not those with the deepest pockets. And introducing reforms to take money out of politics are needed to ensure people's votes are what count, not billionaires' bank accounts. And what we've seen from our research is that political donations in the UK are increasingly dominated by a small number of wealthy individuals and companies, which really raises concerns about fairness and equality in democratic participation. So, for example, in 2023, we found that 19 donors gave over £1 million each, and that accounted for 2/3 of all private donations. And the public can see this and they really don't like it. When you look at public polling, you see that 63% of the public believe the rich have too much influence in UK politics. And this was definitely put into stark contrast last year when in December 2024, there were rumours that Elon Musk was going to be donating $100 million to reform UK. And that would have really blown all other donations out of the water. As a comparison, the largest single donation previously has been 8 million. But the thing is that donation would have been legal because there are no donation caps. And this is in stark contrast to other democracies like Canada, France, Australia. But it's not just donation caps around that big money in politics issue. It's also the amount that parties can spend at elections. That should also be reduced. And this is in the context that 2024 was the most expensive election in history. And also there is an omission to look at sort of the reporting thresholds, which are relatively quite high in the UK, and that thwarts transparency. So sort of to wrap up on the big money in politics issue, the Committee on Standards in Public Life stated that the only way to take big money out of politics was to introduce a donation cap. And with many other democracies having already introduced them, the UK is starting to look a bit like an outlier. And this is a crucial area that the Elections Bill could still address.
Really valuable analysis. Thank you so much, Rose. And over now to Kat.
Thank you so much, Alan. So the question before us is, do the government's electoral reforms go far enough? And my very short answer, based on my years in Westminster scrutinising the previous and now, of course, the current government's approach, is regrettably a pretty emphatic no. The reforms proposed, and indeed some of them already enacted, I think are too timid. They're long overdue measures that the government has. It feels like we've been dragged towards, and it does not feel like the changes that we need to see happen. So I think that the steps we've had are positive, but they're insufficient in terms of where we need to be getting to. So we've had the policy paper out this summer. And I believe that it is right that we take steps towards making the franchise more inclusive. I've stood for the Labour Party in every general election since 2010, and I'm proud that every manifesto I've ever stood on has championed extending the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds, and that's in there. Similarly, I think a movement towards automated electoral registration is not a radical proposal. I think it is a basic administrative necessity in a modern democracy, and frankly should have been implemented years ago. And I think these proposals, if enacted, they're welcome. I'm certainly not knocking them, but just to be really clear, I don't think they represent brave reform. I think they represent the bare minimum that we need to drag the UK electoral system into the 21st century. And that the true test of a government's commitment to electoral integrity lies not in the small palatable concessions it makes, but I think its willingness to reinforce the foundational pillars of trust and independence. And at this test, I'm afraid the government has yet to pass it. And the main reason I would say that, and my central criticism, is one that I voiced repeatedly during the passage of the Elections Act back in 2022. And it just focuses on the government's explicit attempt to compromise the independence of the election referee, the commission, the Electoral Commission. back in committee across the floor of the House back then, and frankly throughout the scrutiny process of that bill, and I warned precisely what the introduction of a strategy and policy statement would achieve, and I stood there and I argued that creating a power for a partisan sitting government, which is obviously one of the key players in any electoral contest, to issue policy guidance to the neutral body responsible for enforcing electoral law was fundamentally corrosive to public trust. And I think it is the ultimate conflict of interest. Back then, I remember saying to Conservative ministers that, you will not be in government forever, and, you're setting up a system for any sitting government to influence policy. And I say that today to my Labour colleagues who are the ministers responsible, that the strategy and policy statement, it might be very nice when you're in government and you think you can influence it, but it's not fair and it's not right. And every government should remember that you're only in government today and there's no guarantees for tomorrow. And the Elections Act, I think, was not an exercise in strengthening electoral integrity. And it was, as I stated during the debate, an exercise in political control. And we're not just arguing about the effectiveness of a policy. I think we're arguing about the very principle of a democratic oversight. So I will not be satisfied until I see the strategy and policy statement taken out of the law, given the Electoral Commission back its independence. And I think that if the government does come forward with a revised strategy and policy statement, which is the indication that I've asked some parliamentary questions about this in the last week or so, I will be making clear that whilst the contents of that will probably be more agreeable to me, the principle of it existing in the first place, I think, is just wrong. Furthermore, I think the government's reforms, are failing to address two other pillars of democratic integrity, and I think that would be political finance and the truthfulness of political speech. So the blurb for this event rightly asks, are tighter rules needed on political donations? Absolutely. We need a system that ensures transparency and prevents the influence of dark money from foreign or unaccountable sources. I think that the current framework is archaic, and the fact that the government's reforms are largely ignoring the deep structural overhaul of political finance that we need to see speaks volumes about the interests that are at play in this debate that we're having today. We're in this position now where the government, I'm a Labour Party MP, this is my government, but we have chosen to regulate the regulator, but not to address the flow of anonymous cash that's going into political campaigns, and that needs to change. And I think, we also need to confront the issue of truthfulness. And I appreciate this is a lot more complicated in the age of social media, but the deliberate dissemination of falsehoods during campaigns is given as an existential threat to informed consent and our democracy as a whole. And I think that the line between robust debate and outright lies, it is difficult to draw, but we have to make an attempt to do that. I'm conscious that I'm running out of time, so I'm very quickly going to just mention the electoral systems, because it's very difficult to talk about reinstating trust in democracy without also addressing the issue of electoral reform. I appreciate that reinstating a supplementary vote for mayoral and police and crime commissioner votes goes some way, but it doesn't actually address the wider issue, which is that all the polling suggests that there is huge support in this country for voting reform. And it's mirrored actually in the views of Labour MPs and colleagues. And I suspect that legislation would be broadly welcomed by government MPs on that matter, and would go a long way to addressing the trust issues that we have in our democratic system. So to conclude, do the government's electoral reforms go far enough? No. I think they offer a few welcome delayed crumbs of franchise reform, while simultaneously maintaining and thus validating the political mechanism created in the Elections Act 22 that fundamentally undermined the institutional integrity and ensures that fairness of the entire contest. So it doesn't go far enough, and I'm looking forward to the debate that we're about to have. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kat. And finally, David.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for inviting me. I agree that the sins of this paper, the policy paper, are sins of omission, not sins of commission. And obviously, I also agree, having moved an amendment to the 2010 Constitutional Reform and Governance Bill to bring in the single transferable vote, apparently the only vote that Parliament's ever had on that since 1918, you can't leave out the question of electoral reform. The current electoral system worked badly anyway. In a multi-party system with 5, 6 parties in the field with a chance of winning, it will just produce farcical results. And the only way to stop that is by changing the system. But other than that, I have 4 points rather than 3, because I'm an academic now. And they come in 2 pairs, which is extremely academic. So donations and spending, commission independence, and enforcement. And Tom mentioned enforcement, but I think needs a few more words. On donations, to follow on from Rosie's point, what those Transparency International figures show, that you can have 2/3 of all the registrable money going into politics from private sources coming from just 19 sources, right? Just 19 people and institutions. Shows a really important problem in the system that isn't really being faced, which is the concentration of power and influence. And this is just a contradiction of the basic notion of political equality. And in part, that situation is caused by there being no donation cap. Because if you're a political party and there's no donation cap, the most efficient use of your fundraising resources is to go for a small number of gigantic donations. There's no need to do mass fundraising if you can just raise all the money from 3 or 4, 5 or 6 sources. So some people say that you don't need a donation cap because the spending cap gets rid of the need for donation cap. That's not true, because the lack of a donation cap causes the concentration of the donor base, and which produces much bigger risks of undue influence. So it might be necessary to introduce a high cap to begin with to allow parties to adjust. But I think that in the long term, I'm no fan of extra state funding of political parties, but in the long term, I think parties have to shift to mass fundraising of small donations from large numbers of people. And I think that's now technically much easier than it was. And I think in the long run, the cap should be set at something that an ordinary person could give. It should be set at a percentage of median income, and a fairly low percentage of that. On corporate donations, I should state my position, which I don't think there should be any corporate donations at all, because corporate donations are a way of driving coach and horses through the system of transparency. A company, in French, a company is not called limited, they're called Société Anonyme. And that's the whole point. They're anonymous. And you can't have a transparent system of political donation while you've got corporations doing it. So, but I realise that no one's going to agree with that. And I realise that it produces all sorts of problems with union funding for labour and so on. But I'd also be against that, and also against unincorporated association funding of any sort. You know, there's some measures in the paper to make it more transparent, but they don't go far enough. But I realise that won't happen. So what I would do instead, if as a compromise, is I would make it the law that for companies to donate, they have to give a legally binding commitment that all of their directors, all of their shadow directors, and all the people with significant control of the company, which is a concept in company law, familiar to company lawyers, all those people need to be permissible donors. And if any of those bodies, directors, shadow directors, persons with significant control are themselves companies, those companies also have to, for the donation to be lawful, also have to make the same declaration, and so on ad infinitum until you get to some proper humans who you can then say these people, are they permissible donors or not? And so that would get rid of the Musk problem completely. On spending, yes, definitely need to reduce the limits, which is getting completely out of hand. We used to be free of some of the problems of the American system because we didn't allow television advertising. But now we've got YouTube ads and ads everywhere with production values that spend lots of money. So we do need to reduce the expansion of spending. But there are some other reforms. One reform is that spending control at national level should apply all the time and not just in the campaign, because the campaign is now permanent. There's all sorts of ways of shifting spending from the campaign to outside the campaign anyway. And for example, there's no limit on national campaigning during a local election campaign, which distorts local election campaigns. So this is one thing that the select committee that I was on in 2006 managed to agree across party, that the control should apply all the time. And I think we should be able to get that through now. On EC independence, I've nothing to add to what Kat said, which is absolutely my view. It is simply outrageous for the government, any government, to pretend that the Electoral Commission is just like any other regulator that should be subject to the policy and strategy of the government. This is bizarre. The ministers, Kenny Badenoch, by the way, was the minister in charge of the bill, keep saying things like the Electoral Commission should be more accountable. But should they be more accountable? But the Electoral Commission's main job is to keep elections fair. So should they be more accountable to people whose main interest is making elections unfair for their own benefit? It makes absolutely no sense. It shouldn't be allowed to pass without comment. But also some other reforms there. The Speakers Committee, I think it's one of Alan's ideas actually. The Speakers Committee shouldn't be allowed to have a single party majority under any circumstances, regardless of the situation in Parliament. And also, with all due respect to the chairs I served under at the Electoral Commission, we need to think about what kind of person is the chair. I think they need to be more frightening. And I think they need to be a High Court judge or a recently retired High Court judge or even a Court of Appeal judge. I realise none of that will stop reform and the right-wing Conservatives who are trying to remove the independence of the judiciary as well. But I think for everybody else, we need the person in charge of the Electoral Commission to be someone of frightening stature, not just the very competent and pleasant people they are now. Finally, on enforcement, the Electoral Commission doesn't want its power back to bring criminal proceedings. I think that's a bit cowardly, but I understand why they're doing it. But assuming that that's not going to happen, we need some way of dealing with the serious end of the criminal offences that might be committed. For example, the criminal offence under Section 61 of taking part in a scheme to evade the controls. And it's quite right for the Electoral Commission to get or to bring within the civil penalty regime of the Electoral Commission lots of those more minor representation of the People Act offences. But I don't think there's any suggestion that the big offences, Section 61 offence, for example, should be included within the civil penalty regime. So that will still be a matter for the police. And the police have shown absolutely no interest in investigating serious electoral offences, as far as I remember. I can't remember a single one that we sent to them that they came back with a prosecution. So the police are not interested. In any case, now there's the problem of elected police and crime commissioners who might be attempting to influence the police. And now we have politicians saying they want to restore operational control over the police to politicians. So that doesn't work. So we need a new solution on the assumption that the Commission doesn't want its power back. And I think what we need is some kind of dedicated Crown prosecutor with the ability to call on police resources from specialist police units, perhaps in the City of London Police that doesn't have a police and crime commissioner, that they can use to investigate. It's a model more like the SFO, although that's probably not the most successful examples. But I suppose what I have in mind eventually is something like a French examining magistrate who can call on the police judiciaire to go and investigate these people, because the people being investigated are powerful, and it needs a powerful enforcement mechanism to counteract them. So those are my 4 points.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Lots of great material there. If we've already had some fantastic questions coming in, so many thanks for those. We'll go to those in just a moment. If you haven't yet put in a question, now is your chance. So please do that in the Q&A function here on Zoom. In the meantime, let me just quickly put a few questions to our panel. Several of you, particularly Rose and David, have talked about further limits on donations to political parties and particularly capping donations. Kat, I wanted you to go to you on this because I think I'm right in saying you've previously expressed some skepticism about whether donation caps would be a useful thing to introduce. I wonder what your thinking is at the moment on this issue.
I have spoken on this before. I would say that the political situation that we live in now is very different to the political situation it perhaps was when I was of that view. And I think that the example of Elon Musk, for example, has completely changed my approach on this. And perhaps, I am open-minded on this, if I'm honest, Alan, in terms of is it a limit on donations or is it a limit on spend? The truth is that I think too much money is going into elections, and it becomes a race of the person who wins the election is the person who can raise/spend the most money and swamp the algorithms on people's mobile phones, that they're getting more adverts and squeezing out other parties. I think one of the best things about British politics has been that we didn't go down the TV advertising that the Americans went down. And I think that for a long time, we were perhaps a bit complacent. And the reality is that a lot of people under the age of 30 now don't watch TV, but maybe under the age of 40 don't watch TV, and are consuming entirely online, where actually basically TV adverts do exist in British politics. They're just being shown on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, and that's where people are seeing it. So to answer your question, Alan, I'm pretty open-minded to it, and that's mainly been changed because I think the amounts of money that have been spent now has got out of control.
Great, thank you. Tom, does the Commission have views on these sort of questions that, as Rose framed them, and about sort of big money in politics?
So I think one of the things that's most important for us is that candidates and parties can talk to voters, and voters can get access to the information that they need about candidates and parties to be able to make decisions. And obviously that involves spending money in large part. So we need to be really careful that we're not reducing the opportunity for voters to receive the information that they need. I think the other thing just about public confidence, I know Rose mentioned the research about general public support for capping donations, for limiting donations from single donors. And I think we have to recognise there is that level of public concern, and that can be damaging to confidence in the integrity of the political finance system and the funding of political parties. But we also know that most normal people, and I'd probably classify certainly myself as not a normal person, and maybe some of us on the call today, don't know very much about political parties, don't know very much about how they're funded. And they have some very strongly held but quite instinctive views about a level of uncomfortableness with public funding, and probably a very general sort of distrust with politics and politicians in general. So I think lots of those attitudes probably cloud or colour a little bit their judgments about political party funding. But what we would need to see is what the impact of those donation caps would be on party income levels, on their ability to talk to voters, and the extent to which those caps would actually effectively improve confidence among voters.
And Rose, you very much advocated caps. What level of cap do you think we should have? I think Transparency International has been quite kind of pushing for quite a low level of cap, whereas there have been concerns expressed. I mean, David suggested that maybe you get to a low cap gradually. There have been concerns expressed, as Tom has just done, around parties' ability to finance themselves if you have a low cap. What is your thinking on the level of cap that would be appropriate?
So I think our thinking started with the report and research and modelling from CSPL in 2011, who did propose a donation cap of £10,000 per donor per year, and also a reduced, spending limit to go hand in hand with that. But there are a number of ways that you can get to a donation cap, like £10,000, and it does become a bit of a matter of political will. But it could be that the cap does start a bit higher than £10,000, and it comes down over the years to that £10,000 limit. But from a corruption risk perspective, the lower the cap, the better. The better it addresses the issue. And I don't want to be sort of too salacious, but sometimes access in the UK, in UK politics, is quite cheap. If you look at the Leaders Group, which was sort of £50,000 to sort of have a dinner with maybe David Cameron or George Osborne. So that's why that lower level might be more appropriate. And also, if you compare it to other countries, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have Australia, who has a cap of 50,000 Australian dollars. France, 7,500 euros. These are quite low levels, and other countries are able to do it. Other political parties are able to do it. A country like Italy, the cap is 100,000 euros as well, which is maybe a bit higher. But their political parties receive absolutely no direct public funding. So, that's why they have that higher cap level. But that's not the case in the UK. We do have some public funding. We have, short money, which I think, the Conservatives got about £5 million. So, from our perspective, the lower the cap, the better. But in terms of a practical way of getting there, it could start higher and then sort of come down.
Good, thank you. I'm tempted to ask many more questions, but I'm also very conscious of limits on time. David, you covered quite a lot in your opening remarks. Are you happy if we go straight into questions from our audience? So Tom Fleming will miraculously reappear on our screens. There we go. And Tom, what do you have for us?
Great, thanks very much, Alan. So I've got 3 questions here to put in the first round. First is one from Catherine Baker, who asks how we can have electoral reforms which get the average person in Britain to engage in politics, both locally and nationally, so that they are seeking to be properly informed and involved via voting. And Catherine notes that turnout of only passionate and often misled individuals is not healthy for the UK. Tom Brake asks a question which he suggests is perhaps particularly for Kat, and asks, what does she think will be the most effective arguments to use to encourage the government to scrap the strategy and policy statement for the Electoral Commission? And then finally in this round, a question from Matthew Dinn, who suggests that by expanding voter ID to include bank cards, it seems likely to him that the requirements for opening a bank account are quite similar to those for having photo ID, and so this may still be missing out the same people. He asks, is this not a missed opportunity to rethink the photo ID requirements more broadly? And has there been evidence from recent elections that photo ID has actually made a difference to elections beyond turning potential voters away?
Great, thank you. So feel free to answer some of these questions, all of these questions as you wish. Perhaps I'll go first to Kat, because Tom was suggesting that his question was particularly for you, and indeed I was planning to ask exactly that question to you if there was time. So that question on how do you actually get the government to accept the abolition of the strategy and policy statement?
I'm going to give myself all kinds of trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. But I think the most persuasive argument for the government to scrap the SPS would be to point out that they aren't going to be in government forever. I think that I could totally see the appeal when you feel like you're sat in government with a huge majority to try and think, well, this is a good thing because we can ask the Electoral Commission to do more to engage with voters and get more voters registered. And I don't think it's from a bad intention. But the reality is that you do not know what future governments look like. Future governments could be very, very different to any government we've ever seen before. And it just makes it easier for a government that was perhaps not as pro-democracy as governments we've seen in the past to be able to move away from that approach. So for me, I think that's the most persuasive argument that we can use. And certainly that's the argument I'm making.
Great, thank you. And do you want to respond to Catherine's question as well? Because I know you care very much about encouraging democratic engagement.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think people need to feel like they've got something to vote for. Forgive me, my pen decided to run out, so I didn't actually make any notes during the Catherine's question being read out there. But from what I can remember, I think the question was about how you engage people in voting. And one of the things that I was reflecting on this morning was the news from the Caerphilly by-election and the conversation there whereby established political parties for too long have gone back to voters who always vote. And I've been brought up in the Labour Party pretty much. I've been a member of the Labour Party since I was a teenager. And there's always been an assumption that you waste your time going to non-voters because you're just wasting the oxygen in the air. You go to people who vote, even if they don't necessarily vote for you, because you know they're going to turn out on the day. And I think that culture over decades and decades and decades has been incredibly unhelpful. And there just needs to be a bit of a rethink from all political parties, I suspect, to engage with voters who don't normally vote and hear those concerns, reflect those concerns, and develop policies that make people's lives better. So ultimately, I think it's a political thing, would be my interpretation, but other panelists may have other ideas on that.
Good, thank you. David, do you want to go next?
Yes, Kat's right about how parties campaign. I mean, I think the canvassing sheets for all parties send you to the people who normally vote. So I think that's something for parties to think about. Actually, I'm worried about the larger culture of anti-politics, which I think some people in politics are now deliberately encouraging, and other people are accidentally encouraging. So there's nothing you can do about the people who are deliberately encouraging it. But so I'll just want to mention one thing about the people who are accidentally encouraging it. There's a long-standing policy, I think, on the part of some people who deal with local government structures, that it's a very bad thing for people to be councillors. And the number of councillors needs to be cut, and that we're always worried about spending money on representation, that it's always seen as a cost, not a benefit, that there are people who are elected to local office. It seems to me that's the opposite of what we should be doing. I'd rather like to live in a society where nearly everyone knew someone who was elected to something. So that being elected wasn't a weird thing. And part of the problem about the separation of politics from ordinary life is that too many people don't personally know an elected person. And there are some other broader social changes that have caused a problem. Declining union membership is one of them, because being elected representative of a union was another way people got to know what it was like to be a representative. But I think so I'm basically now talking to the Labour Party, who are the people who are accidentally encouraging anti-politics, and I think they need to think about that and stop it.
Very interesting.
On the bank card, by the way, there's a contrary argument, which is that so many people have got bank cards that this is a kind of pointless thing to do. But both arguments show that the requirement for ID is entirely misconceived. And it's a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. In fact, I was on the commission when the commission discussed this and came out in favour of ID. And it was only a kind of preventative thing. It was because there's so many reforms going on of the postal vote system to make that more secure, that people felt that fraud would shift to a different area of activity, would shift towards personation. But it hasn't. So there isn't a problem to solve yet. So I'm not really sure what the purpose of the ID requirements are.
Thank you. Rose?
Thanks. So I was going to reply to two of those questions. So encouraging democratic engagement. Firstly, our proposals of introducing donation caps actually come to the heart of this, because what we're trying to say is that the current funding model turns people off, and it doesn't attempt to try and appeal to mass membership. The concentration has been, as David was saying, the easy route, which is trying to pursue a few number of very wealthy individuals. But our proposals are to try and change that. It's not for it to just be appealing to these sort of millionaires, billionaires, but to try and create more of a widespread membership model, which would, donating to political parties is an active democratic engagement. So then on the second question about the Electoral Commission's independence, I would definitely echo Kat's thoughts there about this is about future-proofing as well. It's about future-proofing our democracy for threats that maybe we can't even think of in the future. And removing the statement would enable that. And I would also say that it seemed to me that in the July proposals from the government, at sort of the very end of the statement, they seem to say that the strategy policy statement was needed because the Electoral Commission was going to be given new powers, such as the higher sanctions, and that's why they needed to retain the statement. But I would say to that the Electoral Commission is not unaccountable. There are currently accountability mechanisms there. It's accountable to Parliament through the Speakers Committee. So those mechanisms are already in place. We don't need this additional layer of interference in order to make it accountable.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And Tom.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to just pick up on the engagement question, and I think just flagging the great opportunity and need that we have in changing the voting age for parliamentary elections and elections in England and in Northern Ireland. We need to learn from the experience in Scotland and Wales, which is really about the importance of good quality citizenship education and teaching for young people about elections. We know that young people want more information about politics and more information about elections, and they want to learn that through formal settings in schools in particular. But we also know that teachers are in need of support to be able to deliver those lessons, deliver really good quality teaching about politics and about elections, and be doing that in a way that is clearly impartial, that protects them when they're delivering that education. So we are in the process of starting to develop and deliver with partners across the education spectrum a whole new set of resources and materials that will support teachers to deliver that education and support them in a way that protects them from that sort of risk and concern about impartiality. So I think that's one of the really key areas where we can make a difference. And going back as far as the early years curriculum, the primary school curriculum, to see how that can be embedded, and not just do politics because it's important, but understanding why politics is relevant, understanding the mechanics of how to do that, but also understanding what it means to be a participant in an informed debate and how to look at information, ask for information, interrogate that information in a way that we can help support young people to become informed and engaged voters for the future.
And just very quickly, Tom, does the Commission have a view on bank cards as ID?
So bank cards would be a really big shift away from the existing model, which is, I think others have mentioned, specifically photo ID. So I think we do have to think about the risks there and the risk of reducing the effectiveness of the overall policy. And yeah, great if it does address the gap that's there. We do know that there are a small proportion of people who don't have one of the existing forms of ID. So if we can be confident, and we haven't seen the data yet, if we can be confident that bank cards would help to address that gap, then that could help improve accessibility.
Right, thank you. Let's squeeze in one more round. Constitution Unit events we're experimenting with finishing at 2 o'clock these days, so we don't have much time. But Tom, do you have a further round for us?
Yes, a quick round. So we have William Wallace, who asks if there's any way that we could include within this bill measures to regulate or make more transparent the flow of foreign money into, quote, third-party or non-party campaigns in the UK. Justin Fisher notes that Elon Musk's rumoured donation has sparked a lot of debate despite not actually happening yet, and asks whether the panel think there is a risk that malicious actors could drive reforms simply by suggesting they may embark on an activity. And then David Newman notes that we've said relatively little about Northern Ireland in this session, and asks what changes may come there and who is in charge.
Very good. Thank you so much. Quick responses from each of you, if you can manage 1 minute. Okay. So let me go to David first.
So just to answer William's question, the answer is yes. You just have to have more donation controls on non-party, so-called third-party campaigners, more in line with what parties do. The way to do it, I think, is obviously the way to do it. I think is to ban corporate donations altogether. But you can introduce all sorts of parallel regulations that work for parties, for third-party campaigners. I have to say that when I was in Parliament, I was constantly bombarded by third-party campaigners who thought that any restriction on their ability to affect politics was a violation of their fundamental rights. And I never took that view. I think that third-party campaigners who are affecting the outcomes of elections should be regulated in the same way as parties.
Rose?
Yes, sorry, I'm going to reply to the same question. So there currently are transparency requirements for non-party campaigners. It's a £20,000 threshold. We at Transparency believe that the reporting threshold for companies and individuals across the board should be £500. So that would be a great reduction in that amount. I also would mention, another stakeholder in this potentially is think tanks, and we think there should be much more transparency over some think tanks and where they get their funding from, because they also have a role in influencing politics as well.
Thank you very much. Tom, can I nudge you in the direction of the Northern Ireland question, maybe? Because
I'm so pleased that you have nudged, Alan. I was going to pick that up. So yes, there are some proposals in the policy statement around Northern Ireland. So one really big one is looking to reform the registration canvass process in Northern Ireland, that in contrast to Great Britain only happens once every 10 years. And that's a big exercise, but it's increasingly not working well. And the Chief Electoral Officer, David Marshall, is very keen on making those changes as well. There are some small changes around the electoral identity card in Northern Ireland. But then there are some aspects of the wider reforms that need to be dealt with and managed very carefully in Northern Ireland. So anything to do with donation controls, there are specific provisions that relate only to donations that are accepted in Northern Ireland. So we need to make sure that those are respected and reflected. And also the changes to automatic registration. The Chief Electoral Officer already has access to various data sets that aren't available to other registration officers. And there are differences in the kinds of central government databases that might be available in Northern Ireland. So again, we need to make sure that the Chief Electoral Officer is able to take full advantage of those data sources in a system of automatic or direct registration.
Thank you very much. And Kat?
Thanks. I'll pick up on the question, I think it was from Justin, around the rumours about the Elon Musk donation influencing, because I don't think we've picked that up much, but I think he already is. Like, I think that there are already malicious actors who are influencing British politics and decisions that are made. I think that's clear to see. I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to say. So it is therefore logical to conclude that yes, in the future, malicious actors could drive reforms just by suggesting that they're going to embark upon activity. I thought that was a really observant question, and I thought that's absolutely fair. And in terms of regulating non-party campaigners, I think if you're going to start regulating political finance and trying to take the heat out of the sort of political donation scheme, then it has to also include third-party campaigners as well as political parties more directly.
Thank you so much. Alas, our time is up. Before I thank our speakers, let me remind you that the recording of this seminar will appear on our YouTube channel and podcast feed in the coming days. So please do subscribe to those or look out for information on Blue Sky. We don't have an online event currently planned for November, But we are co-hosting several in-person seminars here at UCL, including one on the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, on the morning of the 7th of November, and one on citizenship education in the context of Votes at 16, picking up on what Tom was saying there, on the evening of the 20th of November. So it'd be great to see some of you at those live events. And do sign up for our mailing list if you haven't already done so, in order to hear about our future events. You can just follow the Get Involved link on the Constitution Unit's website. But with that, let me thank all of you in the audience for attending today and for asking such fantastic questions. Let me thank Tom Fleming for fielding those questions, and Ed Rowe for running things behind the scenes. But especially thank you to our fantastic panelists who brought such richness to this conversation today. To Tom Hawthorn, Rose Whiffen, Kat Smith, and David Howarth. Thank you all very much. Good afternoon to you all.